With the rumored Red Dead Redemption remake or remaster making the rounds lately in the news, it has reignited the hope that the seminal game from Rockstar could finally be enjoyed with better visuals and, importantly, with better performance. With this potential remastering on the horizon, the game could finally be officially set free from its 30 FPS prison, instigated by the technical constraints of the Xbox 360 and PS3, of which really only the Xbox 360 actually managed to reliably hit. Yes, without an official PC release back in the day or other re-releases afterward, the best way to play the game to date has been on Xbox consoles through backwards compatibility plus, where the game there is upgraded to an internal 4K resolution at best, but it still has those weighty controls and that choppiness of 30 FPS. That is the state of things as how they've been officially, at least. Unofficially, Red Dead Redemption has already been remastered. How, you may say? How is it that I, Alex Battaglia, am showcasing this game at 60 FPS and at 4K here in this video? The answer is simple: PC emulation, which allows you to remaster the game for yourself. All of the B-roll footage you've seen on the screen in this video has come to us courtesy of PC emulation, where this 7th generation game, originally running at 30 FPS, now has better resolution, controls, and performance up to and above 120 FPS if your PC is up to the task. And that's what this video is going to be about today. How to remaster the game for yourself, talking about what it's like to play Red Dead Redemption and what hardware that might necessitate. So the first thing to be aware of here is that there are two ways to emulate Red Dead Redemption on PC. RPCS3, which emulates the PS3 version of the game, and Xenia in its Canary branch, which emulates the Xbox 360 version. Now, putting these two emulators side by side without any visual enhancements enabled gives us an idea of which version we'll want to pick. Here we're seeing the essential differences between the Xbox 360 and PS3 version. I think it's quite obvious to notice just how much better that Xbox 360 version looks. It's higher res, it has better shadows, it has also denser vegetation draw at a distance, and the anti-aliasing is also a lot clearer. So already, without even considering the differences between the emulators themselves, the 360 version does seem like the one to go for. When we start comparing performance of the emulation, Xenia becomes really the only reasonable way to remaster the game for yourself. Compared in the most favorable conditions possible for each emulator on a Core i9-12900K with 6400 MHz DDR5 and an RTX 4090, Xenia in its Canary build leaves RPCS3 in the dust when the frame rate cap is removed and we're running the game at the original resolution. On average, Xenia runs almost 3 times faster than RPCS3 while looking better and having less visual artifacting, as some of the particle effects there on RPCS3 can flicker occasionally. Looking at these two side by side and the performance difference, it is astonishing how much faster Xenia is in this Canary build when pit up against RPCS3. Now, there are a number of reasons for this, of course. Some of them have to do with emulator design, for example, but it mainly comes down to the Xbox 360 not being that jalopy car that the PS3 is. It's easier to emulate as a result, and it requires less CPU resources to achieve that high-level visual accuracy. So I think the choice is clear: to remaster the game for yourself on PC, use Xenia's Canary build and the Xbox 360 version of Red Dead Redemption. And that is how I ended up playing around the first 3 hours of Red Dead Redemption again. I enjoyed the sights and sounds of this game brought up to native 4K and capped to 60 FPS with VSync on a 60Hz display. The game is awesome to behold when played in this manner, and the differences I think are readily tangible to series veterans. I felt it keenly as I had played the version of the game on Xbox Series X back compat beforehand, and the most immediate difference to me was the increase in visual fluidity and the improved controls. Player movement response in particular is what I noticed the most, where the controls can feel a bit drunken in times in the original game at 30 FPS. 60 FPS via PC emulation here just feels a lot better when you're controlling the character or engaging in horseback riding. Marston and his trusty steed are now just a lot more responsive with 2 times the frame rate or more. Aiming weapons, though, on the other hand, in my opinion, still, even with the 60 FPS update, is sluggish. And this doesn't have to do with the frame rate or emulation, it's just mainly about the game's inherent design here, and the acceleration curve that it has on a controller stick. Yes, it does feel better than it possibly could at 30 FPS, but it's still going to be limited by the default way Red Dead Redemption handles its initial stick aiming. For the adventurous among you trying to remaster the game for yourself, you can attempt to implement mouse and keyboard controls with gamepad emulation there. I couldn't get it to work in my experience, but I'll link an incredibly detailed blog entry I found on the web that could help you out in the description below. Still, in spite of me not being able to use my preferred input device of mouse and keyboard, I enjoyed my homemade remastering time with Red Dead Redemption. I was swept up in its world again due to the new high resolution and high frame rate, and I was reminded how incredibly impressive a title it was when it released on the Xbox 360. There's such a great physicality to its world, with a lot of interaction there, and really impressive rendering features for the hardware that it was running on. All of which shine much better at high resolution and especially at a high frame rate. I want to draw particular attention to the animation, which has been Rockstar's specialty ever since they started utilizing Euphoria animation. Riding along on your horse or lassoing animals has really never looked better with the smoothness granted by 2 times the frame rate. And yeah, it even looks great at higher frame rates than 60, which work rather well here. I played the game with a VSync locked 120 FPS, and the animation started to take on a quality of its own, with such few gaps in between the arcs of movement. It looked oh so smooth there at full rate, and I think I can show it off rather well how smooth it looks in this video even when slowed down by half to fit within a 60 FPS YouTube container. The fact that 120 FPS worked at all though surprises me. Based on my findings, game speed and game animation speed does not seem incorrect even with the frame rate unlocked above 30 FPS in my testing. It all just kind of works, which is definitely not expected. The animations do break though under one very specific hardware configuration. For example, look at the game here running at an unlocked frame rate on a Core i9-12900K RTX 4090 at the original 720p Xbox 360 resolution. If you notice, the walking animations, and specifically the turning animation of John Marston, looks weirdly sped up. He's turning way too quickly. The correlation I found as to when or how this happens is discovered by looking at the GPU utilization, which is right below the frame rate counter here on the right-hand side. We can see how the GPU utilization is around 70%, so we're essentially CPU limited here in some capacity when emulating the game at these settings on this hardware. If a GPU is at 99%, this animation speedup doesn't happen. For example, here's the game at a much higher resolution of 4K internally. The GPU is pegged at 99% utilization, so the game is GPU limited here. Notice how the turning animation is at a normal speed and not sped up. This is the case in spite of the game being at 90 FPS. Another way to prevent animation speedup is by limiting the game with VSync. We can see that here we're at 120 FPS and at 720p. The GPU utilization is below 99% for sure, but the animation turning speed is not sped up at all. Something about VSync or GPU limits is preventing animation speedup from occurring. It's curious behavior for sure, and the end result is that you'll want to lock down your frame rate in some manner in this game. That's good for control consistency, visual consistency, and of course it makes the game run at the proper emulation speed. Okay, with that out of the way, how do you actually go about remastering the game for yourself? Is your PC up to the task? The emulation of this generation of consoles is notoriously heavy, so not everyone here will be able to reliably get this game up to a high resolution or a high frame rate based upon their PC. On the GPU side of things, I can say playing the game at native 4K is not easy at all. The reason for this is because we are not natively rendering the game on PC here. We're emulating the Xbox 360's GPU here to then render the game. That means invariably much higher load. This is not like running a game that was released in 2010. It is much heavier than that. How heavy, you may ask? Well, an RTX 4090 in the more empty areas of the world when GPU limited is going to be around 80 to 90 FPS. And that's all fine and well, and honestly most of the game does take place in these kind of empty areas. But going into towns with the greater geometry, lights, and skinned objects means it's a lot heavier on the GPU. At the McFarlane Ranch, for example, it's easy to see the FPS dip closer into the 70s at times as it gets heavier. But that is not the worst, of course. At big towns like Armadillo, In the saloon at night, with all the effects there and characters, it's possible to see the GPU-limited frame rate dip below 60 FPS at 4K on an RTX 4090. Yeah, you heard that right. Cutscenes can actually even manage to be heavier. Most of the time, cutscenes do play out at a fine 60 FPS, but some shots and some camera angles are just heavy enough, even though they seem visually unspectacular. And I recorded some low frame rates in cutscenes into the 50s at times on an RTX 4090 at a native 4K. Based on this kind of performance, I would say that only the most massive GPU of the RTX 4090 can realistically get this game up to a great 60 FPS at native 4K, and that says a lot. Even this GPU has to kind of rely on VRR to get a great 4K experience depending upon the content on screen. And as this shows, other GPUs will have to make compromises to lower resolutions, and I'll talk about that in a bit. CPU-wise, things are a bit better, and I can show that off by playing the game at 120 FPS V-Synced on the Core i9-12900K, and it manages 120 FPS really quite often here. If you go into towns though, you can see that the FPS at its worst in those town areas will be dropping into the 90s. Yes, that's a very modern and powerful CPU, but a 90 FPS minimum is actually pretty great for emulation. And it shows that there's enough scaling room here for lower end and older CPUs to have a 60 FPS minimum. Based on the performance of the Ryzen 5 3600, I have a good idea of what CPU that might entail for a lower end experience at 60 FPS. The Ryzen 5 3600, which was originally released 4 years ago now, is fine enough for a healthy performance above 60 FPS in those areas outside of towns, being near 90 FPS at moments there. But riding into a town shows how its minimums leave much to be desired, going down to around 40 FPS at worst. Based on this performance of a Zen 2 CPU, I would gather that Zen 3 CPUs and higher on the AMD side will secure a healthy 60 FPS all around in the game, and on the Intel side, 10th gen and above many core CPUs will do the same. So if you have a CPU released in the last 3 years, you should have a good time here in Red Dead Redemption while being emulated through Xenia Canary. Coming back to the GPUs like I promised, testing at 1440p, it looks like the RTX 3080 and RX 6800 XT are both competent enough to keep the average frame rate above 60 FPS at this resolution, with both not having issues keeping it above 60 even when going to the crowded town where the GPU load is going to be significantly higher. Performing next to each other, we see some interesting differences. The RX 6800 XT runs the emulated game here when GPU limited around 12% faster, which is a nice bump up over the NVIDIA card. So maybe an RX 6800 base without the XT would be enough to run this game at 1440p. But if you notice the frame time graph, the AMD GPU tends to have an occasional spike here or there when running full tilt through the game world. These hitches can be visually seen and curiously persist across multiple runs of the same area, occurring usually around the same location each time, presumably when terrain or assets ahead are loading. I'm not exactly sure the cause of the issue, of course, but the end result is that although AMD cards may perform better vis-a-vis their usual NVIDIA counterpart, the visual fluidity on the AMD cards might be worse than the slower performing NVIDIA ones. For lower resolutions, the GPU required is going to be abnormally high. Based on the performance of an RTX 2060 Super and RTX 2070 Super at 1080p, the GPU required to start hitting the minimum of 60 FPS in the heavier town areas is looking to be something around an RTX 2080 Super and presumably an RX 5700 XT, which I don't actually have here to test. Like I said earlier, we're running the game emulating the Xbox 360 GPU here and not natively, so it's going to be much heavier than it otherwise would be. So now we know the GPU performance and CPU performance here, and hopefully you have a rig that's up to the task, but how do you actually go about setting this thing up? First, you will need the latest build of Xenia Canary and the specific game patch file for the version of Red Dead Redemption you will be loading up in the emulator. This patch file is placed in a patches folder in the Xenia directory, and it contains a number of game modifiers you will want to maybe change. The important ones are to turn off the frame rate limit, add anisotropic filtering, and adjust the base resolution of the game so you can run the game at a resolution you desire. Here you can see a 360p mode, a 480p mode, a 540p mode with 4x MSAA, and of course if you don't edit any of them, the game will just run at the usual 720p with 2x MSAA of the Xbox 360 version. To choose a resolution you want, you have to combine the value seen here with a value chosen in the main Xenia config file located in the main directory. This file right here. The resolution scale multiplier here defaults to 1, and you can change it to 2 or 3. With the default set, you would have 720p, 1440p, and 4K with 2x MSAA. If you chose, for example, 540p in the patch file, you would have 540p, 1080p, and 1620p with 4x MSAA, which I think actually looks particularly clean and awesome. Beyond this, there are other options to watch out for. In the main Xenia config, you can choose audio buffering length, which I would set to 16, and VSync, which should be set to off, and you can instead force VSync in the graphics control panel for your driver. In the patch config file, you will otherwise want to maybe turn on or off motion blur and depth of field if you do not like those effects, and you can also turn on this minor optimization here, which in my experience has no effect on any of the emulation quality. In terms of bugs in the emulator, there's two that can happen if you're using resolution scaling above the original. Sometimes at night, the game's eye adaptation can be a bit overly sensitive, leading to more dramatic swings of light and dark. Similarly, in some areas of the game, point lights without shadows can flicker more rapidly than they otherwise would with res scaling set to off. The emulator is still a work in progress, and I imagine these will be cleaned up in due time. When you are in-game and playing it at your chosen resolution, you can also bring up a context menu with F6 to turn on things like FXAA or FSR 1.0 should you want to. I'm not a huge fan of these post-processing techniques in 2023, but they are there to choose if you really want them. And with that being said, hopefully you can try this Red Dead Redemption home remastering on PC for yourself and experience the game once again, but with much better performance than was ever possible before. It is heavy, but with the right settings and right PC, it is spectacular in motion. That is one area an official remaster could definitely improve upon, as native code on PC would be way more performant and require less intense CPUs and GPUs to reach 60 FPS and high resolutions. Anyway, if you did like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support DF on Patreon to get years of our coverage in high quality for download. Other than that, follow on Twitter, comment below, and as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.